All right, another report on poverty figures and another political war of words. Only this time it is a report by former RBI Governor and top economist Mr. C. Rangarajan that has caused this flutter. The report commissioned by the UPA government 3 years ago has considerably increased the number of the poor in the country. Now this has come about after the cutoff defining the poor was increased by nearly 50%. The report has hiked the poverty cutoff in cities to 47 rupees a day versus the 33 rupees set by the Tendulkar Committee in 2011. The earnings in villages that qualify someone as poor is set at below 32 rupees a day against the older figure of 27 rupees. Now, importantly, this has increased the number of poor in the country by a whopping 9 crore to more than 36 crores. This means that nearly 30% of the Indians fall below the poverty line. Interestingly, the poverty figures have managed to unite politicians, the treasury benches and the opposition alike. Politicians across the spectrum have slammed the fresh figures, saying even the Rangarajan report was unable to reflect reality. Well, the number of India's poor now may rise dramatically by 100 million if the recommendations of the C. Rangarajan Committee on Poverty is taken into account, which comes just ahead of the maiden budget of the Narendra Modi government. Now, the Rangarajan Committee, which has retained consumption expenditure as the basis for determining poverty, has pegged the total number of poor in the country at 363 million or 29.6% of the population as against 21.9% by the Tendulkar Committee, which in turn suggests that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of poor people. Would like to cut across at this point of time to Mr. C. Rangarajan, who's on the phone line with us. Mr. Rangarajan, appreciate you talking to Headlines today, sir. If you can outline the methodology that your committee has adopted, which has been different than the Tendulkar Committee, sir.
Well, all poverty lines are in some sense judgmental. But what we have tried to do is to look at the minimum consumption expenditure that may be required to be made by a person or by a household in relation to food and in relation to non-food expenditures. We have indicated in the report the methodology that we have adopted for determining the minimum requirements in relation to food. It must satisfy the calorie requirements, it must satisfy the fat and protein requirements. In the case of non-food consumption expenditure, our effort has been to prescribe certain norms in relation to the 4 categories of rent, housing, education, and conveyance. Taking all of this into account, we have come to the numbers that you know. But I think the best way to look at it is not in terms of per day, per person. The best way to look at it is in terms of household expenditure per month. Therefore, this will mean a household of 5 will have to is in the rural area has to spend or has to have an income of at least 4,860 rupees, and in the urban areas 7,035. So any household of 5 having a consumption expenditure of less than 7,035 in urban areas and 4,860 rupees in the rural areas will be deemed as poor. And you must also note that these are private consumption expenditures. These have to be interpreted in the context of the public expenditure on so many categories like health and education. And we all know that the public expenditure on health and education have been increasing in the last several years. Therefore, taking all these factors into account, we have drawn the poverty line here. And I would also say that in purchasing power parity terms, this comes to something like $2.44, which is a shade higher than what even the World Bank uses for drawing the poverty line.
Appreciate you, sir, for outlining the methodology that your committee has adopted. What are your key recommendations?
Well, the key recommendation is not about how to reduce poverty, because that is not the mandate to the committee. The mandate to the committee was just to find out a measure of poverty, and that is what we have done. And a measure of poverty is extremely useful to see how far the economy has been able to fulfill the minimum requirements of the society over a period of time. Therefore, measurement of poverty, the poverty ratio over a period of time has important connotations relating to the direction in which the economy is moving.
Sir, it's been contested by many at this point of time that even this report is not an actual true reflection of ground realities.
No. I think as I mentioned to you earlier, it has to be judged in terms of the monthly consumption expenditure per household. I do not think the best way to look at it is per day, per person. After all, the NSSO conducts the consumer expenditure survey not on the basis of individual, it does it on the basis of the household. Therefore, you really have to ask yourself the question whether a household earning 7,000 rupees or 7,035 rupees is poor or not. I think looked at that way, it is reasonable. I know that all of us want our people to enjoy a much higher standard of living, and therefore poverty lines can be drawn at a much higher level. I mean, there is no limit to that. Actually, we can progressively raise it even to much higher levels. But in terms of minimum calorie requirements, fat and protein requirements, and non-food consumption expenditure, this is one way of interpreting it, and I think we have given enough reasons in the report.
Sir, would you hope that Narendra Modi's government, because your report has come out just right ahead of the maiden budget that Mr. Modi is going to give out, would you think your recommendations should be accepted by him?
Well, I think the issue is not any specific recommendation for policy or anything. I mean, I think what we have done is only to measure the level of poverty both in the rural and the urban areas, and that will provide an indication in the direction in which the government wants to move.
So, last final question, sir. How has your committee differed from the Suresh Tendulkar report?
Well, it is all in terms of estimating what is the minimum requirement. I think one important thing that this committee has done, which probably some of the previous committees have not focused on, is in terms of prescribing a certain minimum consumption expenditure for non-food consumption. There have been lots written on fixing the calorie requirements and relating the minimum food consumption expenditure to that. But there has not been anything so far about prescribing minimum non-food consumption expenditures, but which we have done in relation to 4 categories by looking at the median fractile expenditures. I think that is one of the reasons why you will find the urban poverty line that we have prescribed is much higher than what it was in the earlier period. It is almost 41% higher in the urban areas.
Appreciate you joining us, C. Rangarajan, leading economist. Thank you there for giving us your views on this latest report, which has clearly caused a flutter, especially in political circles.